On a sunlit afternoon, Alicia Carter, one of the youngest African-American agents at the FBI, had just concluded a grueling meeting with her team. Having tirelessly worked her way up the ranks, Alicia's prowess in criminal investigation was undeniable. Today, however, wasn't about work. Dressed casually in jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap, Alicia was looking forward to a well-deserved day off. Her plan was simple: grab a coffee and relax in her favorite park spot. As she pulled into the parking lot of a quaint cafe, the quiet neighborhood exuded a blend of suburban charm and small-town feel. After parking her car, Alicia grabbed her phone and wallet, locking the door behind her. The cafe door chimed as she stepped inside, greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of patrons enjoying their afternoon. She ordered a caramel latte and found a cozy seat near the window, perfect for people watching, soaking up the sunshine and catching up on her reading. About 10 minutes passed, and Alicia had barely sipped her drink when a police car pulled into the parking lot. Initially, she paid no heed, assuming it was just another officer taking a break. However, her attention was piqued when the officer, a tall, stocky white man with a stern expression, exited the car and looked directly at her for a moment too long. He entered the cafe, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor, and walked straight toward her. Alicia sensed a shift in the atmosphere as other customers quietly observed the unfolding scene. Stopping at her table, hands on his hips, the officer's stern gaze met hers. "Ma'am, can I see some ID?" he demanded, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual chat. Alicia, surprised but calm, raised her eyebrows. Being in law enforcement herself, she was no stranger to tense situations. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and polite. His eyes narrowed in suspicion as he glanced at her clothes. "I've had some complaints about someone matching your description loitering in this area." Alicia felt a wave of disbelief. Loitering? She was just sitting in a cafe minding her business. She noticed the stares from some patrons and felt her stomach knot. "I'm just having a coffee," she responded, striving to keep her tone neutral. "Is there a reason you're asking me for ID?" The officer's eyes hardened. "Are you refusing to cooperate, ma'am?" Taking a deep breath, Alicia replied, "No, I'm not refusing. But I'd like to know why you're targeting me when I'm clearly not doing anything wrong." The officer's jaw tightened and he leaned in slightly. "Look, you can make this easy or you can make this difficult. But I'm going to need to see some identification now." Sighing, Alicia reached for her wallet, pulling out her driver's license and handing it to him. He looked at it dismissively, barely glancing at the details before handing it back with a smirk. "You from around here?" he asked condescendingly. "Does it matter?" she shot back, her patience wearing thin. The officer's face darkened. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "Just answer the question." Alicia felt her temper flare but maintained her composure. This wasn't the time to lose control. She knew exactly what was happening. The officer didn't see a law-abiding citizen. He saw a black woman who, in his mind, didn't belong. Before she could respond, the officer stepped back and placed a hand on his radio. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he declared, loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. Alicia stared at him in disbelief. "Come with you for what? I haven't done anything wrong." "We can sort it out down at the station," he said coldly. The cafe grew quiet, all eyes now on the scene. Alicia's heart pounded, anger bubbling within. She had faced subtle racism and assumptions based on her appearance before, but this was different. This was humiliating in public. She took a deep breath, reminding herself she was more than capable of handling this. Still, she knew she had to tread carefully. The last thing she wanted was for the situation to escalate. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, standing her ground. "Unless you have a legitimate reason to detain me, I'll finish my coffee and leave on my own terms." The officer's face flushed with anger and he stepped closer, his posture intimidating. "I'm not asking, ma'am. I'm telling." Alicia's fingers twitched, but she remained calm. This wasn't over. "Officer," she said, her voice low but firm, "you have no idea who you're dealing with." As the officer squared up to her, eyes filled with frustration and arrogance, Alicia could feel her pulse quicken. This was far from over. He had no inkling of who she was or the influence she wielded, and that knowledge simmered beneath her calm demeanor. This wasn't the moment to reveal her hand. Alicia understood the value of patience. Years in the FBI had ingrained this skill in her, preparing her for situations like this. The officer's face was now mere inches from hers, and his smug tone only exacerbated the situation. "You can either come quietly or I can make this difficult. Your choice." The few customers in the cafe shifted uncomfortably. Some watched with wide eyes while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. No one seemed willing to speak up for her, and Alicia felt the weight of the silence. She was alone, facing a man who believed he held all the power. Alicia had been in the FBI long enough to know that one wrong move could escalate this situation, but she wasn't about to back down. Keeping her voice calm, she spoke again. "Officer, I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me what crime I'm being accused of. You have no grounds to take me in." The officer's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. Alicia could see it in his posture, the slight puff of his chest and the twitch of his fingers near his holster. He was agitated, but she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of losing her cool. "You're resisting an officer," he said, his voice growing louder. "That's enough of a reason for me." Resisting? Alicia hadn't even stood up from her seat. She was simply sitting in a cafe, minding her own business, and now this man wanted to throw her in the back of his patrol car without any valid reason. She clenched her fists under the table, anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let it show. Before she could respond, the officer's radio crackled to life. He grabbed it from his shoulder, holding it to his ear as another voice spoke quickly through the static. Alicia couldn't hear what was being said, but the officer's face shifted slightly as if he was weighing something in his mind. He glanced at Alicia again, clearly debating what to do next. The silence stretched between them as he listened to the radio, and Alicia took the opportunity to assess her surroundings. People were still watching, but now their curiosity seemed to have turned into discomfort. The tension in the room was palpable. The cafe staff, usually chatty and warm, had gone quiet behind the counter, exchanging glances as they tried to figure out what to do. After a few moments, the officer lowered his radio, his gaze locking onto hers once more. The same smugness returned to his expression, and Alicia knew he wasn't about to back down easily. "Looks like you're in luck," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've got another call to respond to, but don't think this is over. I'm keeping my eye on you." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the cafe, his boots stomping loudly as he made his way back to the patrol car. Alicia watched as he got in and drove off, the sound of his sirens echoing briefly in the distance. As the officer's car disappeared around the corner, Alicia let out a long, slow breath. The tension in the cafe didn't ease immediately, but after a few moments, conversations around her began to pick up again, though much quieter than before. She could still feel the weight of the stares from the other customers. Some looked at her with pity, others with discomfort, but none had said a word during the entire interaction. Alicia took a sip of her now cold coffee, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't afraid, no, that wasn't it at all. She was angry, furious even, but she knew she had to keep her composure. This wasn't the first time she had dealt with a situation like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But the humiliation of it all, the public nature of the encounter, and the officer's obvious bias cut deep. She felt her phone buzzing in her pocket but ignored it for a moment, trying to collect herself. She needed a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened before she even thought about her next move. Finally, she pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. There were several missed calls from her colleague, Agent Stevens, as well as a few messages asking about their upcoming case briefing. Alicia sighed. The timing couldn't be worse. She wasn't sure she was in the right headspace to deal with work after what had just happened, but there was no avoiding it. She sent a quick text back, letting Stevens know she was fine and would catch up with him later. For now, she needed to clear her head and figure out how to handle this. Alicia knew she couldn't let the situation with the officer go unaddressed. This was about more than just her pride, it was about accountability. Alicia picked up her coffee, determined to finish it despite the unease still lingering in the air. She didn't want to be driven out by the actions of one ignorant officer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd cross paths with him. As she sat there, her mind raced. She could report him, of course, but that would only be a temporary solution. This went deeper than one bad cop. This was a system that needed to be confronted. But how? Alicia was used to working in the shadows, gathering evidence, and letting her work speak for itself. She wasn't one to seek attention, but maybe now was the time to change that. Maybe this was her opportunity to do something bigger than herself. Alicia's phone buzzed again, and this time she answered. "Stevens," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk." Alicia hung up the phone, her mind already racing with thoughts about what had just happened. She couldn't shake the interaction with the officer. It was too raw, too real, and it was still gnawing at her. How could someone with such authority treat people that way without knowing anything about them? But Alicia had seen this pattern before, too many times in fact. It wasn't just about one man with a badge, it was about a system that let people like him get away with behavior like that. Her fingers drummed against the table as she mulled over her options. Alicia wasn't about to let this slide, but she also knew she needed to be strategic. This wasn't just about her, it was about all the others who had been mistreated, humiliated, or worse, because of this officer's unchecked power. Before she could delve too deeply into her thoughts, the cafe door swung open. Alicia tensed, expecting the officer's return, but instead a familiar figure walked in. It was her colleague Agent Stevens. His tall, lean frame was unmistakable, and he headed straight toward her as soon as he spotted her. Stevens pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with a concerned expression. "I got your text. What happened?" Alicia leaned back in her seat, her hands wrapped around the now warm cup of coffee. She didn't want to relive the details, but she knew Stevens needed to understand. "I had a run-in with a local cop," she said, her voice measured. "He tried to arrest me for no reason." Stevens' eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? Why didn't you flash your badge?" Alicia sighed. "Because it wouldn't have made a difference. He didn't care who I was, he just saw what he wanted to see." Stevens shook his head in disbelief. "This is getting out of hand. We can't let that slide. What's your plan?" Alicia thought for a moment, her eyes drifting to the cafe window. She could see people walking by, going about their day, oblivious to the encounter she had just endured. The officer had disappeared, but his presence still lingered in her mind. "I'm not sure yet," she said finally, "but I know I need to take action. I can't just let him get away with this." Stevens nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about you, Alicia. This guy could be doing this to other people who don't have the resources to fight back." "I know," she replied quietly. "That's what bothers me the most." The silence between them grew heavy as both agents considered the weight of the situation. Stevens cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We've got that big case briefing later," he said, trying to shift the conversation slightly. "But if you need time to deal with this, I can handle it." Alicia shook her head. "No, I'll be there. This is important, but so is the case. I can't let it distract me from my job." Stevens leaned forward, his voice dropping to a softer tone. "Just don't lose sight of what matters. We've got your back if you need anything." Alicia gave him a small smile of appreciation, but inside, her thoughts were already racing again. Stevens was right, she needed to stay focused on the task at hand, but she couldn't ignore what had just happened. She wasn't the type to sweep things under the rug, and this officer had crossed a line she couldn't overlook. Stevens checked his watch and sighed. "I better head back to the office. You good here?" "Yeah," Alicia said. "I'll catch up with you in a bit." With that, Stevens stood up and gave her a reassuring nod before leaving the cafe. Alicia watched him go, then returned her gaze to the street outside. She had a decision to make. Part of her wanted to track down that officer and confront him directly, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. This was bigger than one confrontation. If she wanted real change, she had to go through the proper channels. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the FBI's internal system. A reminder about the case briefing set for later that afternoon. Alicia had been working on a high-profile investigation for weeks, and they were finally ready to present their findings. She couldn't afford to be distracted by personal matters now, not when so much was at stake. But as much as she tried to focus on work, the officer's face kept flashing in her mind. His smug expression, the way he had treated her like she was nothing. It was hard to shake off. Alicia knew this wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. She glanced at her watch. She had a little time before the briefing and she knew exactly what she needed to do. Alicia stood up, grabbed her coat and walked out of the cafe. The cool breeze hit her face, grounding her in the moment as she made her way down the street. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew where to start. First, she needed to gather information. She had dealt with plenty of officers in the past, both good and bad, and she knew how to work within the system to get the results she wanted. As she walked, Alicia's thoughts shifted back to her training with the FBI. One of the key things she had learned was how to navigate difficult situations without letting emotions take over. She couldn't let her anger cloud her judgment now. This had to be handled carefully, with precision and strategy. She made her way to the local police precinct, her steps steady and purposeful. If she was going to take action, she needed to start here. Alicia wasn't planning on making a scene or confronting the officer directly, not yet at least, but she needed to gather the facts. She needed to know who this officer was, what his record looked like, and whether he had a history of behavior like this. As Alicia approached the precinct, she felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about making sure no one else had to go through the same thing. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to begin the next phase of her plan. Alicia stood at the entrance of the police precinct, the cool air brushing against her face. She hesitated for a moment. This wasn't her first time stepping into a precinct, but something about this felt different. Alicia wasn't here as an FBI agent, at least not yet. At this moment, she was just a citizen mistreated by someone meant to serve and protect. Her badge stayed tucked away for now. Taking a deep breath, she walked through the heavy precinct doors, instantly feeling the shift in atmosphere. The place buzzed with activity, officers going in and out, phones ringing, and voices overlapping. Alicia scanned the room, looking for someone who could assist without drawing too much attention. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also wasn't going to let the officers' actions slide. At the front desk sat a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. Alicia approached her calmly, maintaining a professional but firm demeanor. "Excuse me," Alicia said, catching the woman's attention. "I need some information about one of your officers." The woman raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking up and down as if sizing Alicia up. "And who might you be?" Alicia offered a polite smile. "Just someone looking for some details. I had an encounter earlier today with an officer and I'd like to follow up." The woman leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "What kind of encounter are we talking about?" Alicia's expression remained steady. "An unprofessional one. I'd rather not get into too many details here, I just need to know the officer's name." The woman gave her a hard look before sighing and turning toward her computer. "All right, what time was this supposed encounter and where?" "It was earlier this afternoon, just outside of Jefferson Park," Alicia replied. She gave a brief description of the officer: the tall, stocky frame, the shaved head, the attitude that oozed arrogance. The woman's fingers clacked across the keyboard for a moment before she stopped and glanced back at Alicia. "You're talking about Officer Donnelly," she said, her voice neutral but with a slight edge of annoyance. "Been with the department for a few years now." Alicia nodded, filing away the name, Officer Donnelly. She now had something solid to work with. "Thank you," she said calmly. "I appreciate your help." The woman gave her a half-hearted nod before returning her focus to her computer. Alicia didn't linger, she had what she needed for now, and standing around the precinct wasn't going to do her any good. As she stepped back out into the daylight, Alicia's mind was already at work, turning over the details. Officer Donnelly, she knew she could pull up his records through the FBI's internal system, but for now she had enough to start piecing things together. If this guy had been acting out of line with her, chances were he'd done it before, maybe even to others who weren't in a position to fight back. Alicia headed toward her car, parked a few blocks away. The street was relatively quiet, a few people walking their dogs, a couple of kids riding bikes, but Alicia's thoughts were focused. She needed to make sure her next steps were smart. This wasn't just about reporting a bad cop, it was about holding someone accountable for their actions and making sure it didn't happen again. Once back in her car, Alicia pulled out her phone and dialed Stevens. He picked up after the second ring. "You get what you needed?" he asked, his voice clear through the line. "Yeah," Alicia said. "Officer Donnelly. You ever hear of him?" Stevens paused for a moment, thinking. "Doesn't ring any bells, but that doesn't mean much. Want me to look into him?" "Not yet," Alicia replied. "I want to see what I can find on my own first. But keep it on your radar. This guy's got a bad attitude and I'm not convinced it's a one-time thing." Stevens hummed in agreement. "Just be careful. These local guys can get real defensive when someone starts poking around." Alicia smirked slightly. "Oh, I know. But I'm not backing down." "Didn't think you would," Stevens chuckled. "Just keep me in the loop." "Will do," Alicia said before hanging up. As she put her phone away, Alicia leaned back in her seat for a moment, letting out a long breath. The frustration from earlier still simmered beneath the surface, but now she had a direction. This wasn't just about how Donnelly had treated her, it was about the bigger picture. The fact that someone like him could wear a badge and feel justified in acting however he wanted. Alicia knew the system all too well. She had seen both sides of the law during her time with the FBI. There were officers genuinely dedicated to their communities, who treated people with respect and upheld the values of justice. But there were others like Donnelly who used their power to belittle and mistreat, and that was something she couldn't stand by and watch. The drive back to the FBI field office was relatively short but gave Alicia time to organize her thoughts. By the time she pulled into the parking lot, she had a clearer sense of what she needed to do next. First, she would check Donnelly's record. If there were any complaints or incidents in his file, it would give her more leverage to push back against his behavior. Alicia stepped into the cool, sterile environment of the field office and made her way to her desk. She logged into her computer, quickly navigating through the system to access local law enforcement records. It didn't take long to find Officer Donnelly's file. Her eyes scanned the screen, noting the usual details: his years of service, his commendations. But then she spotted something that made her pause. There were a few complaints on file, mostly minor but enough to raise a red flag. They were from civilians, mostly about Donnelly's attitude, his rough handling during arrests, and his general disregard for basic respect. Nothing had come of the complaints, of course. They were all marked as resolved with no further action. Alicia frowned. This was exactly what she had expected. It wasn't just about one bad day. Donnelly had a pattern and the system had let it slide. Well, not anymore, she thought. This time, things were going to be different. The next morning, Alicia arrived at the FBI office early, eager to continue her investigation into Officer Donnelly. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, and she wasn't about to let his behavior go unnoticed. She had encountered officers like him before, people who believed the badge gave them the right to treat others with disdain and disrespect. But Alicia wasn't just any civilian, she was an FBI agent and she had the means to dig deeper. Settling into her desk, Alicia opened her laptop and began her search, scanning through the FBI's internal database. She could feel the weight of the task ahead, knowing she had to build a solid case not just for herself but for anyone subjected to Donnelly's abuse of power. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug through various records, not just from Donnelly's precinct but the entire district. What she found was disturbing. Over the last 2 years, several complaints had been filed by individuals, primarily people of color, claiming mistreatment by Officer Donnelly during traffic stops or casual interactions. Each complaint had been dismissed or labeled as unsubstantiated. Alicia's jaw clenched. It was a familiar pattern. Victims weren't believed and Donnelly's word was taken as law. But that was about to change. Alicia knew that in the right hands, these complaints could paint a clear picture of misconduct. She didn't want to involve her superiors just yet, but if things escalated, she was prepared to take it as far as necessary. She spent the next few hours gathering more evidence, contacting individuals who had filed complaints. Introducing herself as a concerned citizen, she didn't yet reveal her position within the FBI. Each person she spoke to had a similar story. Officer Donnelly had been rude, unnecessarily aggressive, and often made them feel small and powerless during their encounters. None of them had seen justice. After speaking to the last person on her list, Alicia leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of determination wash over her. This was more than just a personal vendetta, it was about accountability, ensuring that someone like Donnelly couldn't continue to abuse his position unchecked. Just as she was wrapping up her research for the day, her phone buzzed. It was Stevens. "Hey, any updates?" he asked casually, his voice a little less serious than usual. "Yeah, I've been looking into him," Alicia replied, glancing at her screen. "This guy has a history. There are multiple complaints against him, all from civilians who've had bad run-ins, but nothing's ever come of it. They've all been dismissed." "Not surprising," Stevens said with a sigh. "Guys like him know how to play the system. They push just far enough to intimidate people but not far enough to get in real trouble." "That's what I'm seeing here," Alicia agreed. "But it's going to stop. I've already started talking to some of the people who filed complaints, and their stories are consistent. We're building a case." "Think he's got any higher-ups covering for him?" Stevens asked, his tone shifting slightly. "I wouldn't be surprised," Alicia said thoughtfully. "But I'm not sure yet. He's definitely been getting away with it for a while, though, and from what I'm seeing, his behavior is escalating. It's only a matter of time before he crosses a line he can't come back from." Stevens was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again. "Be careful, Alicia. If he finds out you're digging into him, he might try to retaliate. Guys like him don't like being exposed." "I know," Alicia said, her voice firm. "But I'm not backing down." "You never do," Stevens chuckled. "Just keep your head on straight, okay? You're good at what you do but don't get too caught up. We've seen it before, agents who get too personally involved and it clouds their judgment." "I hear you," Alicia said. "I'll be careful." After hanging up, Alicia took a moment to reflect on Stevens' words. He was right, it was easy to let emotions take over when personally involved in a case. But Alicia wasn't going to let that happen. She was determined to see this through the right way by gathering evidence, staying calm, and using the system to bring Donnelly to justice. As the day went on, Alicia decided it was time to make her presence known at Donnelly's precinct. She wasn't planning on confronting him directly but needed to see how things operated from the inside. With her FBI credentials still tucked away, she dressed casually, hoping to blend in as much as possible. When she arrived at the precinct, it was just as busy as the day before. She saw officers chatting, paperwork being shuffled, and the general hustle of law enforcement work. But amidst the chaos, one face stood out: Donnelly. He was standing near the coffee machine, chatting with another officer, a smug grin plastered on his face. Alicia observed him for a few moments from across the room. He carried himself with an air of entitlement, as if he owned the place. She could tell by the way the other officers interacted with him that Donnelly had a certain influence in the precinct, perhaps even a level of fear. He was the type who thought he could do no wrong, the type who believed the badge made him untouchable. Alicia resisted the urge to march over and confront him right then and there. This wasn't the time or place. Instead, she took a deep breath and approached the front desk again. The same woman from the day before was there, looking as uninterested as ever. "Back again?" the woman asked, not even looking up from her computer. "Just following up on some things," Alicia said casually. "Is Officer Donnelly around?" The woman gave a brief glance toward Donnelly, who was still chatting by the coffee machine. "Yeah, he's over there." Alicia nodded, pretending not to notice. "Thanks." She turned and slowly made her way around the precinct, careful to avoid catching Donnelly's attention. She wasn't ready to reveal herself yet. For now, she just needed to observe, to understand the environment he thrived in. The more she knew, the better prepared she would be when the time came to confront him. Alicia left the precinct that day feeling more perplexed than ever. She had seen Officer Donnelly up close, watched how he carried himself, and observed how his colleagues interacted with him. He was smug, confident, and seemed untouchable. But Alicia knew that people like him always slipped up eventually. The key was to be patient and smart about when to strike. The following morning, Alicia sat in her kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee as she reviewed the notes she had taken. Her laptop was open, displaying the profiles of individuals who had filed complaints against Donnelly. The stories were painfully familiar. Black men and women pulled over for minor infractions, subjected to verbal abuse and humiliation. Some had been detained without cause, all feeling powerless against a system that seemed to protect Donnelly. Alicia had to remind herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her pride, it was about fighting for everyone who had been wronged by officers like Donnelly. She knew she couldn't make any missteps, everything had to be done by the book. After finishing her coffee, she got ready for the day and made her way back to the office. The investigation into Donnelly had consumed most of her time over the past week, but Alicia knew it was necessary. She needed to build a solid case, something that could withstand an official review. By mid-morning, Alicia was deep into her research when her phone rang. It was one of the civilians she had spoken to the day before, a man named James who had been pulled over by Donnelly a few months ago. She had encountered officers like him before, people who believed the badge gave them the right to treat others with disdain and disrespect. But Alicia wasn't just any civilian, she was an FBI agent and she had the means to dig deeper. Settling into her desk, Alicia opened her laptop and began her search, scanning through the FBI's internal database. She could feel the weight of the task ahead, knowing she had to build a solid case not just for herself but for anyone subjected to Donnelly's abuse of power. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug through various records, not just from Donnelly's precinct but the entire district. What she found was disturbing. Over the last 2 years, several complaints had been filed by individuals, primarily people of color, claiming mistreatment by Officer Donnelly during traffic stops or casual interactions. Each complaint had been dismissed or labeled as unsubstantiated. Alicia's jaw clenched. It was a familiar pattern. Victims weren't believed and Donnelly's word was taken as law. But that was about to change. Alicia knew that in the right hands, these complaints could paint a clear picture of misconduct. She didn't want to involve her superiors just yet, but if things escalated, she was prepared to take it as far as necessary. She spent the next few hours gathering more evidence, contacting individuals who had filed complaints. Introducing herself as a concerned citizen, she didn't yet reveal her position within the FBI. Each person she spoke to had a similar story. Officer Donnelly had been rude, unnecessarily aggressive, and often made them feel small and powerless during their encounters. None of them had seen justice. After speaking to the last person on her list, Alicia leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of determination wash over her. This was more than just a personal vendetta, It was about accountability, ensuring that someone like Donnelly couldn't continue to abuse his position unchecked. Just as she was wrapping up her research for the day, her phone buzzed. It was Stevens. "Hey, any updates?" he asked casually, his voice a little less serious than usual. "Yeah, I've been looking into him," Alicia replied, glancing at her screen. "This guy has a history. There are multiple complaints against him, all from civilians who've had bad run-ins, but nothing's ever come of it. They've all been dismissed." "Not surprising," Stevens said with a sigh. "Guys like him know how to play the system. They push just far enough to intimidate people but not far enough to get in real trouble." "That's what I'm seeing here," Alicia agreed. "But it's going to stop. I've already started talking to some of the people who filed complaints, and their stories are consistent. We're building a case." "Think he's got any higher-ups covering for him?" Stevens asked, his tone shifting slightly. "I wouldn't be surprised," Alicia said thoughtfully. "But I'm not sure yet. He's definitely been getting away with it for a while, though, and from what I'm seeing, his behavior is escalating. It's only a matter of time before he crosses a line he can't come back from." Stevens was quiet for a moment, then he spoke again. "Be careful, Alicia. If he finds out you're digging into him, he might try to retaliate. Guys like him don't like being exposed." "I know," Alicia said, her voice firm. "But I'm not backing down." "You never do," Stevens chuckled. "Just keep your head on straight, okay? You're good at what you do, but don't get too caught up. We've seen it before, agents who get too personally involved and it clouds their judgment." "I hear you," Alicia said. "I'll be careful." After hanging up, Alicia took a moment to reflect on Stevens' words. He was right. It was easy to let emotions take over when personally involved in a case. But Alicia wasn't going to let that happen. She was determined to see this through the right way by gathering evidence, staying calm, and using the system to bring Donnelly to justice. As the day went on, Alicia decided it was time to make her presence known at Donnelly's precinct. She wasn't planning on confronting him directly but needed to see how things operated from the inside. With her FBI credentials still tucked away, she dressed casually, hoping to blend in as much as possible. When she arrived at the precinct, it was just as busy as the day before. She saw officers chatting, paperwork being shuffled, and the general hustle of law enforcement work. But amidst the chaos, one face stood out: Donnelly. He was standing near the coffee machine, chatting with another officer, a smug grin plastered on his face. Alicia observed him for a few moments from across the room. He carried himself with an air of entitlement as if he owned the place. She could tell by the way the other officers interacted with him that Donnelly had a certain influence in the precinct, perhaps even a level of fear. He was the type who thought he could do no wrong, the type who believed the badge made him untouchable. Alicia resisted the urge to march over and confront him right then and there. This wasn't the time or place. Instead, she took a deep breath and approached the front desk again. The same woman from the day before was there, looking as uninterested as ever. "Back again?" the woman asked, not even looking up from her computer. "Just following up on some things," Alicia said casually. "Is Officer Donnelly around?" The woman gave a brief glance toward Donnelly, who was still chatting by the coffee machine. "Yeah, he's over there." Alicia nodded, pretending not to notice. "Thanks." She turned and slowly made her way around the precinct, careful to avoid catching Donnelly's attention. She wasn't ready to reveal herself yet. For now, she just needed to observe, to understand the environment he thrived in. The more she knew, the better prepared she would be when the time came to confront him. Alicia left the precinct that day feeling more perplexed than ever. She had seen Officer Donnelly up close, watched how he carried himself, and observed how his colleagues interacted with him. He was smug, confident, and seemed untouchable. But Alicia knew that people like him always slipped up eventually. The key was to be patient and smart about when to strike. The following morning, Alicia sat in her kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee as she reviewed the notes she had taken. Her laptop was open, displaying the profiles of individuals who had filed complaints against Donnelly. The stories were painfully familiar. Black men and women pulled over for minor infractions, subjected to verbal abuse and humiliation. Some had been detained without cause, all feeling powerless against a system that seemed to protect Donnelly. Alicia had to remind herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her pride, it was about fighting for everyone who had been wronged by officers like Donnelly. She knew she couldn't make any missteps, everything had to be done by the book. After finishing her coffee, she got ready for the day and made her way back to the office. The investigation into Donnelly had consumed most of her time over the past week, but Alicia knew it was necessary. She needed to build a solid case, something that could withstand an official review. By mid-morning, Alicia was deep into her research when her phone rang. It was one of the civilians she had spoken to the day before. A man named James who had been pulled over by Donnelly a few months ago. "Hey, it's James," his voice came through the phone. "I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday. I wasn't sure if I should say this, but something's been bothering me." Alicia sat up, intrigued. "What is it?" "Well," James hesitated for a moment. "When Donnelly pulled me over, he kept saying things that made it seem like he knew stuff about me, personal things. At first, I thought it was just him trying to intimidate me, but the more I think about it, the weirder it feels. He mentioned my job, my family, stuff I don't usually talk about." Alicia frowned. "Did you ask him how he knew?" "I did, but he just laughed," James said. "He didn't give me a straight answer." Alicia's mind raced. This wasn't just about pulling people over and throwing his weight around. If Donnelly was using personal information to target people, that was an entirely different level of violation. She needed to figure out where he was getting this information. "Thanks for telling me, James," Alicia said, her voice serious. "This could be important. I'm going to look into it. If anything else comes to mind, don't hesitate to reach out." After hanging up, Alicia immediately began to dig deeper. She checked into Donnelly's recent cases looking for patterns. If he was targeting specific individuals, it might show up in his activity. As she scrolled through the records, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Donnelly seemed to pull over the same types of people, usually African Americans with decent jobs and strong ties to their communities. They weren't the typical easy targets that bad cops often went after. Why was he singling them out? Alicia spent the next few hours combing through data trying to connect the dots. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon something even more troubling. Donnelly wasn't just using his position to harass people on the streets. He was accessing personal records, employment information, addresses, even medical history. This was illegal and dangerous. It explained how he knew personal details about people like James, but also raised more questions about what Donnelly was really up to. Her heart raced as she realized the full scope of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. Donnelly was abusing his power in ways that went far beyond a typical bad cop. He was digging into people's private lives, likely without any legitimate reason. A knock on her office door interrupted Alicia's thoughts. It was Stevens. "How's it going?" he asked, stepping inside and noticing the intensity on her face. "I found something big," Alicia said, turning the screen toward him. "Donnelly's been accessing personal records of people he pulls over. This is more than just bad behavior. He's using his position to target specific people, and he's violating their privacy." Stevens raised his eyebrows. "That's serious. Do you think he's working alone?" "I'm not sure yet," Alicia replied. "But it doesn't look good. If he's doing this without anyone questioning him, it means there's a serious breakdown in oversight at the precinct." Stevens leaned against the desk, thinking, "We need to be careful with this. If you go in too hot, he'll catch wind of it, and we don't want him covering his tracks. We need solid proof before we take this higher." "I know," Alicia said, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to let him keep doing this. I'm going to find out exactly how far this goes." Stevens nodded. "Just be smart about it. We don't want to spook him." As Stevens left the office, Alicia turned back to her computer. She knew the risks of pushing too hard too fast, but every moment she waited, more people could be targeted. She had to tread carefully, but she also knew she couldn't let this drag on for too long. Over the next few days, Alicia continued her investigation, carefully gathering evidence without drawing too much attention. She set up meetings with a few more people who had filed complaints, each one adding another layer to the story she was building. With each conversation, the picture became clearer. Donnelly wasn't just a bully, he was deliberately using his badge to intimidate and control specific people. Alicia didn't have all the answers yet, but she was inching closer. One afternoon, after a conversation with a woman harassed by Donnelly, Alicia received an email notification. It was from a contact in the IT department who owed her a favor. The message was succinct. They had traced Donnelly's activity in the system and confirmed that he had accessed personal records without authorization. Alicia's heart pounded as she read the message. This was the hard evidence she needed. However, there was still more work to do before she could confront him. Donnelly was playing a dangerous game, and Alicia needed to ensure all the pieces were in place before making her move. She knew she was getting closer to exposing Officer Donnelly's full scheme, but gaps in her knowledge remained. The fact that he was illegally accessing personal records was enough to cause serious trouble, but she needed to uncover his motive. Why was he targeting these specific individuals? What was his endgame? The more she pondered these questions, the more unsettling it became. Alicia spent hours poring over her notes trying to connect the dots. Each person she interviewed had a similar story: pulled over for a minor infraction, humiliated, and left with no clear explanation. But it was the personal information Donnelly seemed to possess that was most concerning. It felt as if he were targeting people based on more than just race or social status. One morning, while going through her files, Alicia decided to dig deeper into Donnelly's background. She had avoided this earlier, hoping to gather enough evidence before looking into his personal history. Now it felt necessary. She needed to know who he was before he joined the police force. Sitting at her desk, she typed his name and pulled up old records. What she found was unsettling but not surprising. Donnelly came from a long line of police officers, many of whom had served in the same department for generations. His father and grandfather had both worked in the precinct, and it was clear that Donnelly felt a deep sense of entitlement because of his family's legacy. It wasn't just his family ties that caught Alicia's attention. As she scrolled through the records, she found complaints against his father, who had retired a decade earlier. These complaints were eerily similar to those against Donnelly: harassment, racial bias, and abuse of power. It seemed that Donnelly was continuing a family tradition of using the badge to exert control over people, particularly those who couldn't easily fight back. Alicia leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of her discovery. This wasn't just about one bad cop, it was about a culture of abuse passed down through generations. She realized that bringing Donnelly down wouldn't just expose him but could potentially shake up the entire department. The thought made her both nervous and determined. Later that day, Alicia met with Stevens again to discuss her findings. "I looked into Donnelly's background," she said as they sat down at a cafe near their office. "It turns out his father had a history of complaints against him too. Same pattern: racial harassment, abuse of power. It's like Donnelly is carrying on the family tradition." Stevens sighed, taking a sip of his coffee. "That doesn't surprise me. I've seen it before. Guys who think they're untouchable because they come from a line of cops. They feel like the rules don't apply to them." "Exactly," Alicia nodded. "But we need to be careful. This isn't just about Donnelly anymore. If we push too hard, we might uncover more than we bargained for, and I don't know how deep this goes." Stevens thought for a moment. "You're right, but we can't let that stop us. If there's a problem with the culture in that department, it needs to come to light. We're not just going after Donnelly, we're going after a system that allows guys like him to get away with this." Alicia appreciated Stevens' support. She knew this investigation had the potential to make waves, but she was committed to seeing it through. She couldn't stand by while people like Donnelly abused their power. Too many lives were being affected. Over the next few days, Alicia dug deeper into Donnelly's cases. She reached out to more individuals who had been harassed by him, piecing together a timeline of his behavior. Each person had their own story of how Donnelly had used his badge to humiliate them, but Alicia noticed a pattern. He seemed to target people with connections to the community, people who were respected and had something to lose. It was as if he enjoyed tearing them down, reminding them that no matter how successful they were still vulnerable. Alicia's frustration grew with each new story she heard. She knew Donnelly's behavior was a symptom of a larger issue, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. The people he hurt weren't just statistics. They were real lives being damaged by a man who believed he was above the law. One afternoon, Alicia received a call from one of the individuals she had spoken to earlier. It was Regina, a small business owner who had been pulled over by Donnelly 6 months ago. Regina had been hesitant to share details at first, but now she seemed ready to talk. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Regina said over the phone. "I realized something. Donnelly wasn't just pulling me over because I was speeding. He was asking questions about my business like he knew who I was. He mentioned that he had seen me around town before," Regina said, making Alicia's ears perk up. "What do you mean? Did he say how he knew you?" Alicia asked, her curiosity piqued. "No," Regina replied, shaking her head. "But the way he talked, it felt like he had been watching me. It wasn't just a random stop. It felt personal, like he wanted to remind me who was in control." Alicia's stomach churned. This was the second time she had heard something like this. First James, now Regina. Donnelly wasn't just pulling people over for minor infractions. He was targeting them, and it seemed he was gathering information on them beforehand. But why? What was his goal? "Thank you for telling me this, Regina," Alicia said. "It helps a lot. I'm going to keep looking into it." After hanging up, Alicia sat in silence for a moment, trying to piece together the puzzle. Donnelly was clearly going after specific people for a reason, but she still couldn't figure out what he stood to gain. Was it just about power, or was there something more sinister at play? As she continued to work on the case, Alicia found herself growing more and more invested. This wasn't just another assignment, it was personal. She had experienced firsthand what it was like to be humiliated by Donnelly, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. But she knew she had to be patient. The case was building, and soon enough, Donnelly would slip up. When he did, Alicia would be ready. The weight of the investigation grew heavier as the days passed. The more Alicia dug, the more she realized that Donnelly wasn't just a rogue cop operating in isolation. There were deeper connections within the police department. Officers who looked the other way, reports that mysteriously disappeared, and complaints that were never followed up on. It became clear that Donnelly's behavior wasn't just about one man abusing his power, it was about a broken system that allowed people like him to thrive. One evening, after a long day of interviews and research, Alicia sat at her desk, going through the files once again. Her mind kept returning to the conversation she'd had with Regina. Why was Donnelly targeting business owners? What did he gain by harassing people with influence in the community? It seemed too deliberate to be random, but she couldn't figure out his angle. Frustrated, Alicia leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, trying to clear her head. She thought about her own encounter with Donnelly, the way he had belittled her, spoken down to her as if she were less than human. He had enjoyed the power he held over her, the way he could make her feel small with just a few words. But even then, there had been something calculated in his actions. It wasn't just about race, it was about control. He wanted to remind her and everyone like her that no matter how successful they were, they would always be beneath him. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Stevens, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you might need a pick-me-up," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Thanks," Alicia said, taking a sip. "I've been staring at these files for hours and I feel like I'm going in circles." "You're not the only one," Stevens said, sitting down across from her. "I've been looking into Donnelly's old cases and I found something interesting. He's been pulling over a lot of people who are involved in community projects. Business owners, charity organizers, people who have influence. It's almost like he's going after people who could expose something." Alicia frowned. "Expose what? Do you think he's trying to silence them?" "It's possible," Stevens said. "Or maybe he's using them for something, blackmail maybe. If he has dirt on these people, he could use it to his advantage." Alicia's mind raced. That made sense. Donnelly wasn't just harassing these people for fun. He was gathering information on them, probably looking for something he could use to keep them in line. If they were afraid of him, they wouldn't speak out against him, and he could continue to operate without anyone challenging him. "We need to find out what he's using this information for," Alicia said. "If we can figure that out, we'll have enough to bring him down." Stevens nodded. "Agreed. But we have to be careful. If he knows we're on to him, he could destroy any evidence he has." The two spent the next few days working tirelessly, reaching out to more people who had been targeted by Donnelly. Each conversation gave them a little more insight into his methods. He wasn't just pulling people over for traffic violations, he was questioning them about their personal lives, asking about their businesses, their families, their finances. It was clear that he was trying to find weaknesses, something he could exploit. Alicia and Stevens decided to pay a visit to one of Donnelly's former victims, a man named Marcus, who owned a popular restaurant in town. Marcus had been pulled over by Donnelly several months ago for what he thought was a routine traffic stop. But during the stop, Donnelly had started asking him questions about his business, his clientele, and even his employees. At the time, Marcus had thought it was odd, but he hadn't given it much thought. Now, looking back, he realized that Donnelly had been fishing for information. When Alicia and Stevens arrived at Marcus's restaurant, they were greeted by a warm, bustling atmosphere. They were close to uncovering something significant, but they also knew that Donnelly wouldn't hesitate to protect himself if he felt threatened. As they worked late into the night, the sense of urgency grew stronger. They knew they were on the brink of a breakthrough, but they also knew that the next steps would be critical in bringing Donnelly down and exposing the corruption within the department. Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every noise outside made her heart race, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer in her small apartment. "Let's wrap this up for now," Stevens said, glancing at the clock. "We'll meet with Maria and Jamal tomorrow and see what we can find out." Alicia nodded, but as she prepared to close up for the night, she glanced out her window one last time. Anxiety washed over her as she caught a glimpse of a police car slowly driving past her building. It stopped for a moment, the headlights illuminating her apartment before continuing down the street. "Did you see that?" Alicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Stevens turned to look. That police car. It was just parked outside. Stevens frowned. Probably just a routine patrol. Don't let it get to you. But Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence. The stakes were rising, and they had to be ready for whatever Donnelly might throw at them next. The next day dawned bright and clear, but Alicia felt a storm brewing inside her. She and Stevens were meeting with Jamal at the community center, and she knew that this meeting could change everything. They had to tread carefully. Donnelly was still lurking in the shadows, and any misstep could put them all in danger. As they drove to the community center, Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that tension was palpable. Every corner they turned, every passing car felt like a potential threat. Just stick to the plan, she reminded herself. When they arrived, they found Maria waiting for them at a corner table. She waved them over, a determined look on her face. Jamal is running a bit late, she said, her tone calm but serious. He's a bit nervous about talking to you too. We understand, Stevens replied, scanning the room. It's not easy for him to trust anyone, especially with someone like Donnelly in the mix. Alicia nodded. We're here to help. Whatever he decides to share will stay confidential. Just then the door swung open and Jamal walked in. He looked around, his expression uncertain, but when he spotted Maria, he approached their table. Hey, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thanks for coming, Jamal, Maria said, offering him a reassuring smile. We're here to listen, no pressure. Jamal took a seat, glancing at Alicia and Stevens with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. I heard about what you're trying to do, he said slowly, but I'm scared. Donnelly has a way of making people disappear, you know? Alicia leaned forward, her voice steady. We get that. We're not here to put you in danger. We just want to gather information so we can hold him accountable. He hesitated, eyes darting to the side as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Okay, I'll share what I can, but you have to promise me this won't get back to him. Absolutely, Stephen assured him. Your safety is our priority. As Jamal started to speak, Alicia listened intently. He told them about the time Donnelly had pulled him over for a minor traffic violation, turning the situation into an interrogation. He asked me about my friends, what I was doing in the neighborhood. It felt like he was trying to scare me into silence, Jamal recounted, his voice trembling slightly. Alicia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was exactly what they had feared. Donnelly wasn't just a bad cop. He was instilling fear in the community. Jamal described how he'd stopped organizing his youth programs because he felt watched, isolated, and threatened. I didn't want to bring trouble to my family, he confessed. With each detail Jamal shared, Alicia's resolve strengthened. They needed to take this to the next level, to gather more testimonies and build a case that could withstand scrutiny. Jamal, do you have any idea how many people he's done this to? She asked. He thought for a moment. There are others, but they're scared too. They think if they speak up, they'll face consequences. Maria jumped in, her voice fierce. That's why we need to rally the community. If we can show this is happening to many people, we can start to change things. As they continued to talk, an idea began to form in Alicia's mind. What if we organized a community meeting? We could invite others who have had similar experiences and create a safe space for them to share. That could work, Stephen said, his eyes lighting up. If we can get enough people together, we can put pressure on the department to investigate Donnelly properly. Jamal looked uncertain, glancing around the room as if assessing the risks. I want to help, but I don't know if I can face him again. Just remember you're not alone, Alicia said, her voice steady. We're all in this together. The more people come forward, the stronger our case will be. As they discussed logistics, a sense of determination filled the air. They set a date for the meeting, hoping to attract as many people as possible. Jamal agreed to help spread the word, and as they wrapped up their discussion, Alicia felt a glimmer of hope. But as they left the community center, her anxiety returned. They had set a plan in motion, but Donnelly was still a lurking threat. On the drive back, Alicia glanced at Stevens, who was lost in thought. What are you thinking? She asked. I just hope we're ready for what's coming, he replied, his brow furrowing. Donnelly won't take this lying down. That night, as Alicia prepared for bed, her mind raced. The community meeting loomed ahead, and with it the potential for both change and danger. She double-checked the locks on her doors, glancing out the window to ensure no one was watching. But as she climbed into bed, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off to sleep, dreams filled with the faces of those they were fighting for. The next morning she would rise to face whatever came next, ready to uncover the truth about Donnelly and stand against the tide of intimidation. Little did they know, Donnelly was already aware of their plans. He was not the type to let things slide, especially not when his reputation was at stake. The day of the community meeting arrived and excitement buzzed in the air. People gathered, sharing their experiences and forming a network of support. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he shared his story, his voice shaking but steady. Others followed suit, revealing their encounters with Donnelly, each story adding weight to their cause. As the atmosphere grew electric, a police cruiser pulled up outside. A hush fell over the crowd as Donnelly stepped out, a smug look on his face. "What's going on here?" he shouted, trying to instill fear. Alicia felt her heart race, but she stood tall. "We're here to talk about accountability," she declared, rallying the crowd. With the community united, Alicia realized that fear would not win today. Together they stood against Donnelly, ready to fight for their rights and bring justice to their neighborhood. In that moment the lines had been drawn. The struggle had only just begun, but Alicia knew they had each other, and that was more powerful than any badge or weapon. They would not back down.